The wind in this part of the country did not whisper. It scoured. It came down from the mountains with a lonesome howl, carrying dust that tasted of grit and endings. It peeled the paint from the sides of the clapboard house in long, curling strips, and rattled the window panes in their frames until Evelyn Carr was sure the glass would shatter. The land itself was a study in hardship, a vast, sun-beaten canvas of brownland gray, punctuated by the stubborn green of sagebrush and the skeletal arms of mesquite trees. This was the edge of Briar Ridge, and for Evelyn, it was the edge of the world. She lived here in a state of quiet penance, working for a dying woman on a ranch that was dying right alongside her. Miss Geneva's ranch had once been a respectable spread, but now the fences leaned like tired old men, and the barn roof had a hole in it that stared up at the sky like a vacant eye. The work was hard, a litany of chores that began before the sun and ended long after it had bled out behind the horizon. She hauled water from the well, its rope coarse against her palms. She mended clothes until her fingers were pricked and sore, the tiny wounds a small, familiar pain she could control. She cooked bland, soft meals for Miss Geneva, whose life was now confined to a bed in a room that smelled of lavender and decay. Evelyn found a strange sort of refuge in the labor. The ache in her back, the burn in her muscles. These were honest feelings, earned and simple. They were a bulwark against the other things, the memories that coiled in the quiet moments, waiting to strike when she was exhausted, truly bone-weary. Her mind was blessedly empty. The silence of the plains would seep into her, and for a little while, she could almost forget who she was, or rather, who the town of Briar Ridge thought she was. They called her cursed. She had heard the whispers on her rare trips into town for supplies. They followed her down the dusty main street, sharp and stinging as horseflies. The women would pull their children closer, their faces tightening into masks of pious disapproval. The men would either look straight through her, as if she were a ghost, or watch her with a sly, knowing sort of pity that was far worse. She was the disgraced judge's daughter, a name forever tied to scandal, to a violent night years ago that had shattered her family and left her adrift. Evelyn Carr, the girl who had brought ruin upon her own house. The whispers said she was touched by darkness, that she carried her father's sins like a shroud. They never spoke of the truth, because the truth was an ugly, inconvenient thing, and Briar Ridge had long ago decided which story it preferred to believe. So she stayed away, making the ranch her entire world. The dry earth beneath her worn boots, the vast, indifferent sky above her head, the wheezing breaths of Miss Geneva in the other room. This was her reality. It was a small, spare life, but it was hers. She asked for nothing and expected less, and in that, she found a fragile kind of peace. Cole Whitaker arrived as quietly as the heat haze that shimmered on the horizon. He was just a man on a horse, riding in from the south, his belongings tied in a tight roll behind his saddle. He did not ride into town with any fanfare. He went straight to the Henderson place, the ranch that bordered Miss Geneva's property to the west, and asked for work. Silas Henderson, a man whose moods were as unpredictable as the weather, hired him on the spot. Henderson needed a reliable hand, and something in the stranger's steady gaze suggested he was exactly that. Evelyn saw him for the first time a few days later. She was out by the chicken coop, scattering feed, when she noticed him in the distance. Mending a stretch of fence that separated the two properties, he moved with an economy of motion, each swing of the hammer precise and powerful. He was not a large man, but he was built solidly, with a kind of wiry strength that came from years of hard work. He wore a plain, dusty hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He never once looked her way. He simply worked, a silent figure against the vast emptiness of the land. Their first meeting happened a week after his arrival. Miss Geneva, in a moment of lucidity, had insisted Evelyn take a freshly baked loaf of bread and a pot of beef stew over to Mr. Henderson. It was a neighborly gesture, a holdover from a time when such kindnesses were common currency. Now, it felt like an ordeal. But Evelyn would never deny Miss Geneva anything. So she wrapped the bread in a clean cloth, secured the lid on the pot, and made the short walk across the parched fields. She found him in the barn, sharpening a blade on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. He looked up as her shadow fell across the doorway, his hand stilling. His eyes, she noticed, were a startlingly clear shade of gray, like a winter sky. They were watchful, guarded, and held no judgment she could read. "I'm from the ranch next door," she said, her voice sounding thin and unused. "Miss Geneva sent this for Mr. Henderson." He stood, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his trousers. He took the pot and the bread from her, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest of moments. The touch was accidental, impersonal, yet a jolt went through her, sharp and unwelcome. She pulled her hands back as if she had been burned. His gaze flickered over her face, and for a second, she thought she saw a question in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "He's out with the herd," Cole said. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. "I'll see he gets it. Much obliged." "You are welcome," she replied, the words stiff and formal. An awkward silence stretched between them. The air was thick with the smell of hay, leather, and horse. He made no move to fill the silence, simply stood there, waiting. He seemed entirely comfortable in his own quiet, a man who did not feel the need to clutter the world with unnecessary words. It was unnerving. Most people, when faced with her, either filled the silence with nervous chatter or hurried away. He did neither. "I should be getting back," she finally managed, turning to leave. "Ma'am," he said, a simple acknowledgement as she walked away. She did not look back, but she could feel his eyes on her until she was halfway across the field. The encounter left her unsettled. He had not been unkind, nor had he been overly friendly. He had simply been present, and in her world, where she was treated as if she were either invisible or a spectacle. His calm neutrality was the strangest thing of all. That night, the terrors came for her. They always started the same way. A feeling of suffocating darkness, the weight of a heavy blanket pressing down on her, stealing her breath. Then came the sounds, the splintering of a door, a woman's scream that was her mother's, and a man's low, drunken laughter. The smell of whiskey would fill her senses, acrid and sickening. She would be a girl again, frozen in her bed, listening to the sounds of a life being torn apart in the next room. In the dream, a hand would reach for her, rough and calloused, and she would try to scream, but no sound would come out. The touch was a violation, a branding that seared itself into her soul. It was a touch that promised pain and stole innocence, a touch she could never, ever forget. She woke with a strangled gasp, sitting bolt upright in her narrow bed. Her nightgown was soaked with sweat, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark and silent, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She clutched the thin quilt to her chest, her knuckles white. It was just a dream, the same dream she had been having for 10 years, but it never felt like just a dream. It felt like a memory that lived inside her, a poison that had seeped into her very bones. She rose, her legs trembling, and went to the window. Moonlight silvered the landscape, making the world outside look cold and alien. She stared out at the endless plains, feeling an emptiness inside her that mirrored the vast, dark expanse. She could not bear to be touched. A simple, accidental brush of fingers from a stranger in a barn had been enough to unlock the gates of her deepest fears. The wall she had so carefully built around herself felt paper-thin, fragile. The quiet cowboy with the winter gray eyes had done nothing, and yet his presence had disturbed the fragile peace she fought so hard to maintain. Cole Whitaker noticed things. It was a habit born of a life spent on the trail, where a man's survival could depend on noticing a snake in the grass or the distant glint of a rifle barrel. He noticed the way the wind shifted before a storm, the way a horse favored a leg before it went lame, and he noticed Evelyn Carr. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders, as if she were constantly bracing for a blow. He saw the way she worked, with a fierce, desperate energy that seemed aimed at shutting out the world. From the Henderson fence line, he watched her haul water, her thin frame straining with the effort, her movements economical and strong. He saw a bruised gentleness in the way she cared for Miss Geneva's withered rose bushes, her touch on the leaves delicate and careful. He saw, too, the way the people from Briar Ridge treated her. When the circuit preacher made his monthly rounds, he stopped at the Henderson place but passed Miss Geneva's ranch without a glance. When the mail carrier came by, he would leave the letters in the box at the end of the long dirt lane rather than ride up to her door, as he did for everyone else. Cole had been in town once for supplies and had seen her there. He watched as two women from the church guild crossed the street to avoid walking past her on the boardwalk. They had looked at her with a mixture of fear and contempt that made his jaw tighten. He did not know the story, and he did not ask. Prying into another person's past was not his way. He had his own ghosts, his own reasons for keeping his distance and moving from place to place. He recognized a fellow traveler in the lonely country of sorrow. Whatever had happened to her, it had marked her deep. He respected the silence she wrapped around herself like armor, because he understood the need for it. Their paths crossed again during the storm. It came on suddenly, as storms often did in that country. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple, and the wind began to shriek. Cole was out in the far pasture, checking on a newborn calf, when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. By the time he was halfway back to the barn, the heavens had opened up in a torrential downpour. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry ground to slick, treacherous mud. A crack of lightning, brighter than day, split the sky, followed by a peal of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Henderson's prize mare, a high-strung chestnut named Delilah, panicked. With a terrified scream, she reared, splintering the top rail of her corral and bolting into the teeth of the storm. "Damn it all!" Cole swore, pulling his hat down and running for his own mount. He saw her run past Miss Geneva's property, a dark shape against the gray curtain of rain. He urged his horse on, fighting to keep his seat on the slippery mud. Delilah was running blind, wild with fear, heading straight for the rocky, broken country to the north. He was so focused on the runaway horse that he did not see Evelyn until she was almost beside him. She had pulled a heavy oilcloth slicker over her dress and was running, her face pale and determined, her hair plastered to her head by the rain. "She's heading for the ravine!" Evelyn shouted over the roar of the wind. "You have to turn her!" Cole was startled to see her. She should have been inside, safe from the storm, but there was no time for questions. She was right. The mare was running straight toward a deep, dangerous gully hidden by the downpour. "I need to get ahead of her," he yelled back. "Cut through my pasture! The gate is open! It's shorter!" He did not hesitate. He trusted the certainty in her voice. He veered his horse, galloping through the open gate she had indicated. The new path gave him the angle he needed. He was able to get in front of the panicked mare just as Evelyn, on foot, came up from the side. Working together in the chaos of the storm, they created a barrier, a human and equine wall that forced Delilah to slow, to turn. The mare's eyes were white with terror, her sides heaving. Cole dismounted, speaking to her in a low, calming voice, his movements slow and deliberate. Evelyn stood her ground, a small, unmovable presence in the deluge, blocking the horse's path of escape. Finally, Cole was able to grab the broken reins. The fight was over. The mare stood trembling, defeated by her own fear and their combined resolve. For a long moment, They both just stood there in the pouring rain, breathing heavily. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. They were soaked to the bone, their clothes heavy with water, mud clinging to their boots. Cole looked at Evelyn, really looked at her. Her face was streaked with rain and dirt, her usual guard completely washed away. In its place was a raw, fierce strength he had not seen before. He had seen a woman willing to run into a dangerous storm to help a stranger save a terrified animal. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "She would have broken her leg in that ravine." Evelyn just nodded, unable to speak, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden shiver running through her that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm had broken through her defenses, forcing her into the world, into action, into proximity with this quiet man. "You're freezing," he stated, his voice softening slightly. He started to shrug off his wet jacket, a purely instinctual gesture of protection. "No," she said quickly, taking a step back. "I am fine. I have to get back." He stopped, letting his jacket fall back onto his shoulders. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in the mare's. He gave a slow nod of understanding. He led the two horses, his own and the trembling mare, and walked beside her as they made their way back toward the light spilling from her cabin window. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was a shared space, filled with the sound of the rain and their footsteps squelching in the mud. It was the quiet of two people who had faced a small piece of chaos together and won. When they reached her cabin, he stopped at the porch steps. "You should get inside. Get warm." "You as well," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of the courage and vulnerability they had both witnessed. A fragile bond, forged in the heart of a storm. He watched until the cabin door closed behind her, then turned and led the horses into the unrelenting rain. That night, Evelyn fell into a sleep born of pure physical and emotional exhaustion. The warmth of the fire he had helped her restart seeped into her bones, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of safety that was not entirely of her own making. But safety was a fleeting thing. The dream came, as it always did. The darkness, the suffocating weight, the scent of whiskey, the splintering door, her mother's scream, the rough, hateful laughter, the hand reaching for her in the dark. But this time, something was different. Through the murky terror of the nightmare, another image pushed its way forward, the image of a man standing in the driving rain, his gray eyes steady, his voice calm as he gentled a frightened horse. A man who had looked at her not with pity or contempt, but with something that looked like respect. The two images warred in her mind, the terrifying hand from her past and the quiet strength from her present. Fear and a new, unfamiliar longing twisted together inside her, a painful, confusing knot in her chest. She was so tired of being afraid, so tired of being alone. She woke not with a scream, but with a sob that caught in her throat. Tears tracked silently down her temples and into her hair. The room was dark and still, the storm having passed. In the profound silence of the night, she was achingly aware of her own solitude, of the cold, empty space in the bed beside her. A deep, primal ache rose up from the broken places inside her, a desperate need for comfort, for safety, for a human warmth she had denied herself for a decade. It was a wanting so fierce it terrified her. She did not understand it. She did not know if she was wanting an end to the pain or for someone to share it with. She only knew that the feeling was powerful, undeniable. Her lips parted, and a whisper escaped into the darkness, a confession to the ghosts that haunted her. "I can't stop wanting you." The world after the storm felt newborn, washed clean and tender. The air, stripped of its dust, smelled of wet earth and sage, and the morning sun cast long, gentle shadows across the plains. The tension that had lived in the sky was gone, and in its place, a quiet stillness had settled. It was a stillness that Evelyn felt inside herself, a fragile peace that had followed the chaos of the night before. In the days that followed, the silence between her and the man on the neighboring ranch began to change. It was no longer a space of awkward distance, but one of shared understanding, a quiet territory they had earned together. From her kitchen window, she watched Cole Whitaker work. He moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm that seemed to be in harmony with the land itself. There was an integrity in his labor, a deep-seated respect for the tasks at hand. She saw it in the way he soothed a nervous colt, his voice a low murmur, his hand firm but gentle on its flank. She saw it in the patient, meticulous way he repaired a broken axle on the buckboard, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not curse when a tool slipped or rage when a job proved difficult. He simply worked, his quiet competence a stark contrast to the blustering noise of other men she had known. His care for the animals, in particular, touched a place deep inside her. He treated them not as brute tools, but as living creatures deserving of kindness. That simple, unspoken decency was a language she understood far better than words. They began to speak, their conversations as spare and essential as the landscape around them. He would be riding the fence line, and she would be out in her garden, pulling weeds. He would tip his hat. "Morning, ma'am," and she would surprise herself by looking up and meeting his gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker." A brief smile might pass between them, a small, tentative thing, like the first wildflower pushing through the hard-packed earth of spring. Once, he brought over a stray calf that had wandered onto Miss Geneva's property, its leg caught in a tangle of old wire. Evelyn came out with a bucket of warm water and clean rags, and together they worked to free the frightened animal. Cole held it steady while she carefully snipped the wire away and cleaned the wound. Their hands brushed several times, and while she still felt the instinctive tightening in her gut, the urge to recoil was lessened. She was able to hold her ground, her focus on the task, on the small life they were saving. When they were done, he looked at her, his gray eyes soft with an unnamed emotion. "You have a gentle hand," he said, and the simple compliment warmed her more than the midday sun. These small kindnesses became the threads from which a fragile trust was woven. But inside the dim, quiet rooms of the ranch house, a different season was ending. Miss Geneva was fading, the last embers of her fierce spirit slowly turning to ash. Her breathing grew shallow, her moments of lucidity fewer and farther between. One afternoon, as Evelyn sat by her bedside, spooning cool water between her dry, cracked lips, the old woman's eyes fluttered open. They were clear, for the first time in weeks, and sharp with a sudden, urgent clarity. "Evelyn," she rasped, her hand, thin as a bird's claw, reaching for Evelyn's arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You listen to me, child." Evelyn leaned closer. "I am here, Geneva." "When I am gone," the old woman said, each word an effort. "You cannot stay here. You must pack your things and leave this place." A cold dread washed over Evelyn. "This is my home." "No," Geneva insisted, her eyes boring into Evelyn's. "This is a place of ghosts. Your ghosts. This town, it has a long memory, and it is a bitter one. It will never forgive you. Not for what your father did, and not for what you said." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "They will not let you have this land. They will not let you have peace. They will chew you up and spit you out, just as they did to him. You hear me? You run, and you do not look back." The old woman's words were a knife, slicing open a wound that had never truly healed. The past, which Evelyn fought so hard to keep buried, rushed to the surface, its stench as foul as unearthed grave dirt. Later that evening, sitting on the porch as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and faded rose, she let the memories come. She remembered her father, Judge Isaac Carr, He had not been a perfect man, but he had been a just one, a man who believed the law was a shield for the innocent, not a cudgel for the powerful. He had a booming laugh that could fill a room and hands that were surprisingly gentle when he'd check her for fever or brush a stray hair from her face. He was her rock, the center of her world. Then the scandal had begun, a dark stain that spread through their lives. It started with whispers of land theft, accusations that Sheriff Miller and his son, Maddox, were using their positions to intimidate homesteaders and seize their claims. Her father, as the circuit judge, began to investigate. The town grew tense. People chose sides. Friends became strangers overnight. The night it all shattered was seared into her memory. There had been a town social, a rare night of music and dancing. Evelyn, then just 17, had stepped outside for a breath of cool air. Maddox Miller had followed her. He was older, handsome in a cruel sort of way, and walked with the arrogant swagger of a boy who had never been told no. He had been drinking. He had backed her against the wall of the livery, his breath hot and sour with whiskey, his words slurred and ugly. She had told him to leave her be, but he had only laughed. He had grabbed her, his hands like iron bands on her arms, and in the struggle, he had torn her dress. His mouth had been brutal, his intentions clear. She had fought back, raking his face with her nails and kicking him hard enough to make him stumble. She had run, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, shame and terror choking her. She told her father everything. The next day, the fury in Judge Carr's eyes was a terrifying thing to behold. He had publicly accused Maddox Miller of assault and called for the sheriff to stand down while an outside investigation was conducted. Briar Ridge had exploded. The Millers were one of the founding families, powerful and respected. Evelyn was just a girl. The town, already simmering with resentment over the land investigation, chose to believe the Millers' version of the story, that a vengeful girl, bitter that Maddox had spurned her, had lied to help her father ruin a good family's name. They called her a liar, a harlot. The women who had once patted her head now looked at her with contempt. The men looked at her with a new, speculative gleam in their eyes. No one believed her. No one but her father. The memory of the town meeting was the sharpest shard of all. It was not a formal trial, just a gathering of angry, fearful people in the church hall. Her father stood before them, his voice ringing with conviction, defending her honor, demanding justice. And she saw the faces in the crowd, the cold, closed-off expressions of people who had already made up their minds. She saw Maddox, a smug, triumphant smirk on his face, a fresh scratch still visible on his cheek. In that moment, she felt a profound and soul-crushing shame, not for what had happened to her, but for being the cause of her father's ruin. She had brought this down upon him. Her truth had become his cross to bear. 2 nights later, a shot rang out in the dark. They found her father slumped over his desk in his study, a bullet hole in his chest and a bottle of whiskey, untouched. On the table beside him, the sheriff ruled it a suicide, a final, cowardly act of a disgraced man. The investigation into the land claims was dropped. The assault accusation was buried. The town of Briar Ridge breathed a collective sigh of relief and closed ranks. Leaving Evelyn alone with the wreckage, she never wavered from her story, never lied about what had happened, but her truth had been deemed worthless. A deep, abiding anger simmered beneath her shame. Anger at Maddox, at the town, at a world that could be so willfully blind to the truth. But the anger had no outlet. So it turned inward, eating away at her until all that was left was a hollow ache and a quiet resolve to never be that vulnerable, that powerless, again. A few days later, Cole found her staring at a broken section of fence on the southern edge of her property. It was a long stretch, the posts rotted, the wire rusted and sagging. "That's a 2-man job," he said, pulling his horse to a stop beside her. She looked up, startled out of her reverie. "I can manage." He looked at the fence, then back at her. A hint of a smile touched his lips. I'm sure you could, but it'd go faster with two. I've got a morning free tomorrow. I'll bring the posts. It was not a question, but a simple statement of fact. Evelyn found herself agreeing before she had a chance to erect her usual defenses. The thought of spending a morning working alongside him was both terrifying and undeniably appealing. The next day, they worked in a comfortable, efficient silence. He dug the post holes with powerful, rhythmic thrusts of the digger, while she followed behind, setting the heavy new posts and tamping the earth around them until they stood straight and true. The sun was hot on their backs, and the physical labor was a welcome distraction. For the first time in a very long time, she felt like she was building something instead of just holding back the decay. Around noon, he stopped. "Time for a break." He retrieved a canvas sack from his saddle. "Brought some lunch." He led her to a massive, ancient cottonwood tree that stood alone in the middle of the prairie, its broad leaves shimmering in the slight breeze. They sat in its shade, the coolness a welcome relief. He handed her a piece of jerky and a thick slice of bread and cheese. They ate in silence for a few minutes, watching a hawk circle high in the cloudless sky. "Why are you here, Mr. Whitaker?" she asked suddenly, the question surprising her as much as it did him. He chewed his jerky thoughtfully before answering. "Just passing through, I suppose. Same as always." He looked out at the horizon, his gaze distant. "I do not stay in one place for long." "Why not?" The question was bold, but the easy quiet between them seemed to invite it. He was silent for a long moment, and she was sure he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low. "I had a place once, a wife. We had a small homestead up in the Montana Territory. Her name was Anna." He said the name softly, as if it were a fragile, precious thing. "We were expecting our first child. The winter came on hard that year, snowed us in good. The baby decided to come early. She was in a bad way. Something was wrong. I tried to ride for help, for the doctor in the nearest town, but the snow was too deep. The horse went lame. By the time I made it back on foot, it was too late." He stopped, his jaw tight. He picked up a small stone and turned it over and over in his palm. "I lost them both. I buried them under a pine tree on a hill overlooking our cabin. After that, staying still felt wrong. Every sunrise on that porch was just a reminder of what I had failed to do, who I had failed to protect. So I started moving. Figured if I did not put down roots, there would be nothing for the frost to kill." He carried his own guilt, she realized, a burden as heavy as her own. His past was not a scandal, but a tragedy. Yet it had marked him just as deeply. He did not trust emotional closeness, not because he was cold, but because he was terrified of the cost of losing it. An overwhelming wave of empathy washed over her. She saw the pain he kept so carefully hidden behind his quiet exterior. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand hovering just above his, wanting to offer some small comfort, some acknowledgement of his sorrow. Her fingers were a mere inch from his when the old, familiar panic seized her, the specter of Maddox Miller's unwanted touch. The memory of that violation rose up like a phantom. Her breath caught in her throat. She snatched her hand back as if the space between them were a hot stove. Cole saw it all. The impulse, the hesitation, the stark fear that flashed in her eyes before she masked it. He did not say a word, did not react, but a profound shift occurred within him. Her reaction was not the simple shyness of a reserved woman. It was something deeper, something violent. He was beginning to understand that she was afraid of more than just a simple touch. She was afraid of the very idea of it, the town's shunning of her, the haunted look she carried, and this visceral, terrified reaction. They were all pieces of a puzzle he did not have the full picture of yet. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this woman was carrying a wound that someone else had inflicted upon her, and a fierce, protective instinct, one he thought had died with his wife and child, began to stir within him. He wanted to protect her, but he had no idea what he was protecting her from. The next week, Miss Geneva took a turn for the worse. The doctor had to be called from Briar Ridge. He left a bottle of laudanum for the pain and told Evelyn there was nothing more to be done. To get the prescription filled, she had no choice but to ride into town. She hated it, hated the feeling of all those eyes on her, stripping her down to her shame. She tied her horse in front of the general store, keeping her head down, her focus on getting what she needed and leaving as quickly as possible. As she stepped off the boardwalk, a group of men spilled out of the saloon next door, their laughter loud and abrasive. She recognized them immediately, ranch hands and layabouts who spent more time drinking than working, and leading them, a cruel smile on his face, was Maddox Miller. He had grown heavier in the 10 years since that night, his face puffy and his middle thick, but his eyes held the same arrogant cruelty. He saw her and stopped, his smile widening. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying down the street. Look what the wind blew in. Still wandering around where you are not wanted, Evie? His cronies snickered. Evelyn froze, her blood turning to ice. She ignored him, turning to walk toward the apothecary at the other end of the street. What is the matter? Maddox called after her, his voice mocking. Too good to say hello to old friends? Or maybe you are just in a hurry. Got some other good man's name to ruin? The laughter from the men grew louder. Humiliation burned in Evelyn's cheeks. She quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her. She could feel their stares like physical blows. Suddenly, a quiet voice cut through the noise. That is enough! Evelyn looked up. Cole Whitaker had stepped out of the blacksmith shop across the street. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on Maddox, his gray eyes as hard and cold as flint. He walked across the dusty street, his steps deliberate, his presence radiating a quiet, lethal authority. He stopped a few feet from the group, placing himself between them and Evelyn. Maddox bristled at the challenge. This ain't none of your concern, stranger. You are making a public nuisance of yourself, Cole said, his voice still low, but carrying an unmistakable threat. And you are bothering the lady. I suggest you and your friends go back inside and finish your drinks. Maddox stared at Cole, sizing him up. He saw a man who was not looking for a fight, but who would most certainly finish one. For a moment, his arrogant pride warred with his sense of self-preservation. Prudence won. With a dismissive sneer, he turned back to the saloon. Come on, boys. The air out here is starting to stink of self-righteousness. The men followed him back inside, grumbling. Cole did not move until the saloon doors swung shut behind them. Only then did he turn to Evelyn. Her heart was pounding, her hands trembling. Are you all right? He asked, his voice now gentle. She could only nod. The words caught in her throat. He had defended her, in front of everyone. He had stood up for her. No one had done that since her father. He had seen her humiliation and had stepped into it without a moment's hesitation. Go on and get what you need, he said softly. I will wait. True to his word, he waited on the boardwalk while she hurried into the apothecary. When she came out, he walked with her back to her horse, the space between them a shield against the curious and hostile stares from the windows they passed. He said nothing more, but his presence was a comfort more profound than any words could be. That night, Evelyn could not sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. The light was bright enough to see the Henderson ranch in the distance, a single lamp glowing in the window of the bunkhouse where she knew Cole slept. Her hand came up to rest on the cool window pane, as if she could somehow feel the quiet strength of the man across the fields. Miss Geneva's warning echoed in her mind. This place will never forgive you. And Maddox's cruel taunts proved it true. The town would always see her as the liar, the source of the trouble. But Cole, he had not seen that. He had seen a woman being harassed, and he had acted. He saw her, the real her, the one buried under years of shame and fear. A terrible, Aching sadness filled her chest. For a decade, she had convinced herself that she deserved this lonely life, that she was unworthy of kindness, of protection, of love. It was easier to believe their judgment than to fight it. But Cole's simple, decent act had cracked that lonely fortress. He made her want things she had long ago forbidden herself from wanting. Hope, safety, affection. Her heart ached with the terrifying, impossible desire for this quiet, gentle man. A man whose own wounds were as deep as hers. A man who deserved a whole woman, not one who was broken into 1,000 pieces. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Her breath hitched, and a whisper, fragile and full of a pain she could not name, fogged the glass in front of her. Why do I want someone I do not deserve? In the quiet evenings that followed, after the chores were done and the house settled into a listening silence, Evelyn took up one of Cole's work shirts. He had torn it on a piece of barbed wire while helping her secure a loose section of the chicken coop, and had left it behind with a shrug, dismissing it as beyond repair. But to Evelyn, the worn blue cotton felt like a relic, something imbued with the quiet strength of the man who wore it. The fabric was faded across the shoulders from years of sun and sweat, and it smelled faintly of sawdust and clean air. Mending it became her secret ritual. Sitting by the low light of a kerosene lamp, she would set to work with a needle and thread. Each tiny, precise stitch was an act of deliberate care. She was not just closing a tear in the cloth. She was trying to mend a tear in the lonely fabric of her own world. This small, secret gesture felt like a prayer. It was a way of reaching out to him, of offering a piece of herself without the risk of words. With every pull of the thread, she felt a flicker of hope, an unfamiliar and tentative warmth in her chest. It was the feeling that perhaps she was not entirely lost, that in the act of caring for something that belonged to another, she was proving she was worthy of being cared for herself. Mending this shirt made her feel almost like someone worth loving. The end for Miss Geneva came as gently as a final exhalation. Evelyn found her one morning as the sun was rising, her face peaceful in the pale light, her hands resting on the quilt as if she had simply drifted off in the middle of a pleasant dream. The house, which had been filled for so long with the sounds of labored breathing and quiet suffering, was now utterly, profoundly silent. The silence was a vast, empty space, and Evelyn felt her own smallness within it. She had known this was coming, had prepared herself for it for months, but the finality of it was a physical blow. She washed the old woman's frail body, dressed her in her finest church dress, and sat with her until the preacher arrived. She was devastated. Geneva had been more than an employer. She had been a shield. Her presence had given Evelyn a reason to be on this land, a purpose that deflected the town's scorn. Now, that shield was gone. Evelyn was no longer a caretaker. She was just a solitary woman in a house that was not hers, on land that did not belong to her, surrounded by a community that wished she would vanish. She was utterly alone, and the vulnerability of her position settled on her like a shroud. The funeral was a spare, lonely affair. Evelyn stood by the fresh grave under the vast, indifferent sky, listening to the preacher recite words that felt hollow and inadequate. Cole was there. He did not stand with her, but kept a respectful distance at the edge of the small cemetery, his hat held over his chest. His silent presence was a comfort, a single, solid point in a world that had suddenly become unstable. When it was over, he walked her back to the empty house, the silence between them heavy with unspoken grief. He left her at the porch, with a simple, "If you need anything, Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her given name. A week later, the town made its move. The preacher, Mr. Davies, arrived at her door, his face a mask of solemn duty. He was accompanied by Sheriff Miller. The sight of the sheriff, Maddox's father, made the hair on Evelyn's arms stand on end. "Miss Carr," the preacher began, clearing his throat. "We have come on an official matter regarding the estate of the late Geneva Miller." He seemed to be avoiding her eyes. Sheriff Miller, however, looked directly at her, his expression cold and unyielding. "The will Geneva filed last year has been contested. It leaves the house and the full 160 acres to you. Several prominent citizens have come forward to express their concern that she was not of sound mind when she signed it, that perhaps she was unduly influenced." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Unduly influenced. They were accusing her of manipulating a dying woman. They were calling her a thief. "She knew exactly what she was doing," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and fury. "She was my friend." "Be that as it may," the sheriff said, his tone dismissing her words entirely. "The court will have to decide. Until then, the property is considered a contested asset. You will be allowed to remain in the house for the time being, but you are not to sell off any stock or equipment. The matter will be settled when the circuit judge arrives next spring." Next spring? It was only autumn. They meant to leave her in a state of legal limbo for months, a squatter in her own home, with the threat of eviction hanging over her head. It was a cruel, calculated move designed to break her spirit, to make her life so uncertain that she would simply give up and leave. She knew, with chilling certainty, that Sheriff Miller and his son were behind it. This was their way of finishing what they had started 10 years ago. This was how they would finally erase her, and her inconvenient truth, from Briar Ridge for good. As the days grew shorter and colder, the weight of her isolation pressed in. The house felt cavernous and empty. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window panes, sounded like an intruder. She began to feel like a ghost in her own life. It was into this bleak emptiness that Cole Whitaker began to appear. He did not ask if she needed help. He simply started showing up. The first time, he arrived at dawn with an armload of firewood, which he stacked neatly on her porch. "The nights are getting colder," was all he said. Another day. He appeared with his tools and spent the afternoon securing the loose boards on the barn roof. His hammer blows a steady, reassuring rhythm against the silence. He carried her water, his shoulders straining under the weight of the heavy yoke, a task that always left her own arms shaking with exhaustion. At first, she resisted. Her pride, the only thing she had left, bristled at the idea of accepting charity. "I can manage on my own, Mr. Whitaker," she would say, her voice tight. "I know you can," he would reply, his voice calm and even, as he continued his work. "But you do not have to." His persistence was a quiet, relentless force. He never pushed, never demanded thanks. He simply saw a need and filled it, his actions a clear and steady declaration that she was not alone. Slowly, reluctantly, she began to let him in. She started leaving a cup of hot coffee on the porch railing for him in the mornings. She would offer him a plate of stew at midday, and they would eat on the steps, speaking little, but sharing a comfortable silence that was more soothing than any conversation. She began to lean into his presence, to depend on the sound of his horse approaching at dawn, to feel a sense of security that she had not felt since her father was alive. He was becoming her anchor in a world that was trying to set her adrift. One bright, clear morning, he arrived with a wagon loaded with fresh cedar posts. "Your garden deserves a better fence," he announced. "Something to keep the deer out this winter and the rabbits out next spring." The old fence around her vegetable garden was a sagging, pathetic thing. She had spent the summer patching it, but it was a losing battle. The idea of a new, strong fence felt like an impossible luxury. "I cannot pay you for this. Cole," she said, the use of his first name feeling both strange and natural on her tongue. He looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "I am not asking for pay. Evelyn?" This time, she did not argue. Instead, she picked up a shovel and began to help him dig the post holes. They worked together all day under the crisp autumn sun. He showed her how to stretch the wire taut, how to secure it with staples so it would not sag. They fell into an easy rhythm, their movements complementing each other as if they had been doing this for years, and for the first time Evelyn could remember. She felt a lightness in her spirit. At one point, Cole's hammer slipped, striking his thumb with a dull thud. He swore under his breath. Shaking his hand, Evelyn, seeing his grimace of pain, let out an involuntary giggle. He looked up, surprised, and then a slow grin spread across his face. He began to chuckle, a low, rumbling sound. Soon, they were both laughing, the sound bright and clear in the open air. It was the first time she had truly laughed in years, a genuine, unburdened laugh that came from deep inside. It felt like breaking the surface of dark water and taking a deep, clean breath of fresh air. In that moment, surrounded by the scent of freshly turned earth and cedar, with this quiet, steady man laughing beside her, she felt a profound and simple happiness. But happiness in her world was a fragile, fleeting thing. Just as she began to feel a sense of hope, of possibility, the darkness on the edge of her life began to creep closer. Maddox Miller started appearing again. She would see him when she rode toward the creek for water, him just sitting on his horse on the ridge line, watching her. He never waved, never called out. He just watched, a silent, menacing presence. Then, the encounters became closer. He cornered her one afternoon at the edge of her property, his horse blocking the path back to her cabin. "Enjoying the place?" he asked, his voice slick with false congeniality. "You should. It will not be yours for long." "This is my home," she said, forcing a strength into her voice she did not feel. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This land belongs to people who know their place, people who do not tell vicious lies. The town is just waiting for the judge to arrive so they can set things right. It would be a whole lot easier for you if you were long gone by then." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low snarl. "I can still take things from you, Evie. Do not ever forget that." He wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving her trembling, the familiar cold dread seeping back into her bones. He was reminding her of his power, of her vulnerability. He was reminding her that he could still hurt her, and that the town would let him. The warning came a few nights later. She had been out late, securing the chickens against a coming frost. As she walked back to the cabin, the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the yard. She reached the porch and went to open her front door. And then she saw it. Nailed to the center of the door was the body of a dead rabbit. Its head hung at an unnatural angle, and a single, dark drop of blood had traced a path down the weathered wood below it. The sight was so shocking, so grotesque, that for a moment, her mind refused to process it. Then, a wave of nausea and terror washed over her. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. She began to tremble, her entire body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. This was not just a threat. This was a promise, a brutal, bloody message. It was a reminder of violence, of death, of what happened to small, helpless creatures who got in the way. She knew, with a certainty that was as cold and sharp as the nail driven through the small body, that Maddox had done this. He was telling her what he was capable of. He was telling her that the fences she and Cole had built could not protect her. She stumbled back from the door, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The safety she had begun to feel, the fragile hope she had nurtured, was shattered. The night, which had moments before been peaceful, was now filled with menace. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps. She was alone. She was exposed, and she was terrified. She could not stay in the house, not with that thing on the door, not with the knowledge of who put it there and what it meant. There was only one place to go, one person. Without thinking, without even grabbing a shawl against the biting cold, she ran from the house, across the dark open ground that separated her property from the Henderson place. She stumbled over the uneven earth, her only guide the single point of light glowing in the bunkhouse window. Her lungs burned, and a sob tore from her throat. She was running from a dead rabbit on a door, but she was also running from a 10-year-old memory, from a town's betrayal, from a life of fear that had just caught up to her. She burst into the bunkhouse without knocking, the door slamming open against the interior wall. Cole was sitting at a small table, cleaning a rifle. He shot to his feet, his face a mixture of shock and alarm as he saw her standing there, wild-eyed, trembling, her chest heaving. "Evelyn, what is it? What is wrong?" She could not speak. The words were trapped behind the terror. She just shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself as another violent shiver racked her body. He was beside her in an instant. He did not touch her, but his presence was a wall of warmth and concern. He saw her terror, the sheer animal panic in her eyes, and his expression hardened. He gently guided her to the single chair by the small wood stove, his hand hovering near her back but never making contact. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from his bunk and wrapped it firmly around her shoulders. "Just breathe," he said, his voice low and steady, a calming anchor in her storm of fear. "You are safe here." She clutched the blanket, the rough wool a grounding texture against her frantic senses. After a few long moments, her breathing began to even out, the violent trembling subsiding to a slight tremor. "It was Maddox," she finally choked out, the words raw and broken. "He is trying to scare me away. He left a warning." That was all she could say. The image of the rabbit was too horrible to describe. It was a part of the truth, but it was not the whole story. The whole story was a tangled, ugly thing that was still lodged deep in her throat. Cole's jaw tightened, and a dangerous light kindled in his gray eyes, but he did not press her for more. He saw that she was on the verge of shattering. He simply pulled up a wooden crate and sat before her, his presence solid and unwavering. He just sat there, letting her know with his silence that he would wait, that he would protect her. His simple, unconditional comfort was her undoing. The dam of restraint she had maintained for a decade, the wall she had built brick by painful brick to keep the world out, finally crumbled. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, then another. The blanket fell away as she lunged forward, burying her face in the rough fabric of his shirt, her hands clutching him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. She broke down in his arms, crying for her father, for Miss Geneva, for the girl she had been, and for the woman she was terrified she would never become. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. His arms came around her, holding her securely, his hand stroking her hair. He held her as she wept, absorbing her grief and her fear into his own quiet strength. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she did not pull away. She remained pressed against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. She felt his warmth, his solidity, and a sense of safety so profound it made her ache. And in that moment of absolute vulnerability, the deepest truth of her heart spilled out. She tilted her head back to look at him, her face wet with tears, her eyes pleading. A whisper, trembling with all the love and fear and brokenness inside her, escaped her lips. "I can't stop wanting you," she breathed against his chest. "Even though I am broken." His world narrowed to the woman trembling in his arms, her confession a raw, whispered wound in the quiet of his bunkhouse. He held her until the last of the shudders subsided, until her breathing evened out into the ragged rhythm of pure exhaustion. Her words, "Even though I am broken," echoed in his mind, not as an admission of weakness, but as a testament to a strength he was only beginning to understand. He knew then that he could not simply be a passive comfort. He had to understand the nature of the thing that had tried to break her. He walked her back to her cabin through the cold, moonless night, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a silent promise of protection. When they reached her porch, He saw the grotesque warning still nailed to her door. A cold, quiet fury, different from any anger he had known before, settled deep in his bones. He told her to go inside and light a lamp, his voice gentle but firm. While she was inside, he worked the nail loose with the pliers from his saddlebag, his movements precise and economical. He took the small, broken body and wrapped it in a piece of burlap, carrying it far out into the darkness of the plains, where he would bury it before the sun came up. He would not allow her to see it again. He would take this ugliness and put it in the ground where it belonged. In the days that followed, Cole began to listen. He was not a man for gossip, but he became a student of it, sifting through the idle chatter of Briar Ridge for the hard kernels of truth. He started at the source, with his employer, Silas Henderson, a man whose family had been in the valley for 50 years. One evening, while sharing a bottle of whiskey on the porch, Cole steered the conversation. "That car woman," he said, keeping his tone casual as he stared out at the darkening fields. "She seems to be carrying a heavy load." Henderson took a long swallow from his glass. His eyes narrowed. "Some loads you are born into," he said gruffly. "Her father, the judge, he was a good man, but a stubborn one. Got crossways with the Millers. Never ends well when you do that." "The sheriff and his boy?" Cole asked. "The whole clan," Henderson grunted. "They run this town. Cole. Always have." The judge started digging into some of their land dealings. At the same time, his girl, Evelyn, made an accusation against the boy. Maddox, a terrible thing to accuse a man of. It tore the town apart. "What did she accuse him of?" Cole kept his voice even, his gaze fixed on a distant star. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Things between a man and a woman. The kind of thing where it is just her word against his, and his word, being a Miller, was worth more." The judge stood by her. Of course, his own flesh and blood. But it ruined him. He lost the town's respect. A few weeks later, they found him dead, shot himself in his study. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. The whole business left a bad taste. Most folks just want to forget it ever happened. Cole listened, letting the silence stretch. He heard what Henderson said, but he also heard what he did not say. He did not say he believed Maddox. He did not say Evelyn was a liar. He just said it was her word against his, and that the town had made its choice. Cole knew that sometimes the easiest choice was not the right one. His quiet investigation confirmed his deepest suspicion. Something had happened to Evelyn. Something terrible. And the entire town had conspired to bury her and the truth right along with it. His knowledge of her pain changed the space between them. It was no longer just a shared loneliness. It was a shared world. Their quiet moments together became the most essential parts of his day. They would sit on her porch steps as the sun rose, the sky turning from bruised purple to fiery orange, sipping hot coffee from tin mugs. They rarely spoke, but the silence was rich with unspoken understanding. He was no longer just a neighbor doing chores. He was a fixture, a presence she had come to rely on. The desire between them grew, a current running just beneath the surface of their quiet interactions. It was electric, a palpable thing in the air when she handed him a cup of coffee and their fingers brushed. It was in the way his gaze would linger on the curve of her neck as she turned to look at something in the distance, and the way her breath would catch when he stood too close. It was a restrained and patient wanting, born of respect for the deep wounds they both carried. He knew she was not ready, and he would not push. But the waiting was a sweet, sharp ache in his chest. The first kiss happened, as their first real connection had, during a storm. The clouds rolled in late one night, thick and black, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf. A loose shutter on an upstairs window began to bang relentlessly against the side of the house. Cole, who had been lingering on her porch after a shared supper, stood up. "I will get that." She followed him out into the whipping wind. Rain was beginning to fall. cold and sharp. He had to climb onto the porch railing to reach the shutter, his boots slipping on the wet wood. Evelyn held the lantern high, its light dancing in the wind, her other hand instinctively going to his belt to steady him. The touch was electric. He looked down at her, his face illuminated in the flickering light, his hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. The sound of the storm, the banging shutter. The entire world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a small circle of light and turmoil. He secured the shutter and stepped down, his body close to hers. He did not move away. He lifted a hand and gently brushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. She looked up at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm that matched the storm's fury. She saw the wanting in his eyes, a reflection of the same ache that lived inside her. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. She stood her ground, her gaze locked with his. When his lips met hers, a tremor went through her entire body. It was a jolt of fear, a ghost of old traumas. But then, another feeling rose up, stronger than the fear. It was a feeling of rightness, of safety, of finally being seen. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. It was the first time she had let herself be touched like that, truly touched, in 10 years. The kiss was gentle and deep, and it tasted of rain and a decade of unspoken longing. Their newfound closeness, however, did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, as Cole was replacing a rotted post in the Henderson Corral, Sheriff Miller rode up, his horse kicking up dust. The sheriff was a big man, with a hard face and eyes that missed nothing. "Whitaker," he said, his voice a low growl of authority. Cole stopped his work and looked up, his expression neutral. "Sheriff, I have been hearing things," Miller said, leaning on his saddle horn. "Hearing you are spending a lot of time over at the old car place. Some might say too much time. Some might be better off minding their own business." Cole replied, his voice level. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "The car girl is trouble. She has a history of it. She brings it on herself, and she brings it on anyone who gets too close. You are new here. You do not understand how things are. I am giving you some friendly advice. Stay away from her, if you know what is good for you." "I appreciate the advice, Sheriff," Cole said, turning back to his post hole. "But I tend to make my own judgments about people." The sheriff sat there for a long moment, his stare a physical weight. Then, without another word, he spurred his horse and rode away. The message was clear. A line had been drawn. The town's whispers swelled into a low roar. The gossip followed Evelyn like a shadow. When she went to the general store for flour and beans, the women would stop talking when she entered, their eyes following her with a mixture of condemnation and prurient curiosity. She heard the word witch whispered behind a cupped hand. They accused her of bewitching the newcomer, of using feminine wiles to trap a good man in her web of lies and misfortune. The old story was dredged up, told in hushed, slanted tones. Some wondered aloud if maybe, just maybe, there was more to what happened all those years ago. But for most, it was easier to believe that Evelyn Carr was a cursed woman, a blight on their town, and that Cole Whitaker was her latest victim. Maddox, emboldened by his father's support and the town's renewed hostility, grew bolder. He found her one morning as she was leaving the general store, her arms full of provisions. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path, a cruel, self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Heard my father paid your new pet a visit," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You should listen to him. He's just trying to protect a simple man from a complicated woman." Evelyn tried to step around him, but he moved with her, cornering her against the storefront. "You think he is going to save you?" he sneered. "He does not know you. He does not know what you are, what you did, how you lied about me. But do not you worry. Evie, I will be happy to tell him. I will tell everyone the real story. I will shout it from the rooftops this time, until there is not a person in this territory who does not know you for the liar you are." A cold, sickening fear washed over her. He was going to twist the truth, to paint her as the villain all over again, and this time he would poison Cole against her. She stood there, frozen, her knuckles white as she clutched her packages, just as despair began to consume her. Cole's voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here, Evelyn?" He had come around the corner and seen the scene at a glance, Maddox looming over her, the fear on her face. Cole's expression was calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He walked directly to Evelyn's side, ignoring Maddox completely. He gently took the heavy packages from her arms. Then, in full view of the half-dozen people on the street who had stopped to watch, he reached down and took her hand. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm and reassuring. It was a simple, unambiguous gesture of ownership, of alliance, of absolute defiance. "Let us go home," he said, his voice clear and steady for all to hear. He turned and led her away, leaving Maddox standing there, his face a mask of impotent fury. That night, the storm inside Evelyn finally broke. Back in the fragile safety of her cabin, the weight of the day, of the past 10 years, came crashing down. She stood in the middle of the room, trembling. Cole put the provisions on the table and came to stand before her. "You do not know," she whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "You defended me. You held my hand in front of them all, but you do not know the truth of what they think of me, of what he says I did." Cole's expression was gentle. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. "Then tell me," he said softly. "Tell me everything." And she did. The story she had held inside for a decade, the story that had been silenced and twisted and buried, came pouring out. It came out in a torrent of broken words and weeping, a raw and agonizing confession. She told him about that night at the social, about Maddox following her, about his drunken advances and the brutal way he had grabbed her. She told him about the fight, the torn dress, the terror and the shame. "He said no one would believe me," she cried, the memory as fresh as if it were yesterday. And he was right. She told him about telling her father, about his righteous anger, and about the town meeting where her neighbors and friends had looked at her with scorn and disbelief, choosing to believe the son of the powerful sheriff over the daughter of the honest judge. She told him about the whispers, the isolation, and the crushing weight of being called a liar when she had done nothing but tell the truth. Finally, she told him about her father's death. "The sheriff said he shot himself," she whispered, her voice raw with an old, unhealed grief. "But he did not. My father would never have done that. He would never have abandoned me. They killed him because he would not back down, because he was going to expose them all. They killed him for defending me, and they made it look like he took his own life in shame." When she was finished, the room was silent save for the sound of her ragged breathing. She was hollowed out, empty, having given him the ugliest, most painful parts of herself. She waited for the judgment, the doubt, the flicker of disbelief in his eyes. But it never came. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his face hard as granite, his eyes dark with a cold, controlled fury. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the fierce, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "They lied," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Not you, Evelyn. Them. Every last one of them." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes, his own blazing with a conviction that stole her breath. "You will never face them alone again. I swear it." He held her close, letting his unwavering belief be the balm on her oldest wounds. After a long time, he tilted her chin up and kissed her. It was not like the kiss in the storm, which had been full of surprise and pent-up longing. This kiss was different. It was slow and deep and exquisitely tender. It was a kiss that asked for nothing but her trust, a kiss that sealed his vow. It was a promise of sanctuary. She answered that promise with a trust of her own. Later that night, in the quiet of her bedroom, they lay down on top of the quilt, still fully clothed. He drew her close, her back against his chest, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. She could feel the warmth of his body, the solid presence of him shielding her from the ghosts and the darkness. They did not speak. They simply lay there, breathing in unison, their hearts pounding out a new, hopeful rhythm in the quiet of the night. It was an intimacy more profound than any passion, a fragile peace found in the wreckage of the past. The telling of her story did not break Evelyn. It forged her. In the days that followed her confession, a subtle but profound change took place. The haunted, fearful look in her eyes was replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. She had shared the heaviest part of her soul with Cole, and he had not buckled under the weight. He had held it, and in doing so, had given her a portion of his own strength. They were a unit now, a silent partnership forged in trauma and trust. The unspoken desire that had flickered between them now burned with a clear, warm light. They were waiting, not for a sign, but for the right moment, for the world to grant them a space safe enough for the love they both now acknowledged. Cole knew that comfort and belief were not enough. Justice was a debt that had been owed for 10 years, and he intended to see it paid. The opportunity came in the form of a notice nailed to the door of the general store. The town council, at the behest of Sheriff Miller, was holding a public meeting at the church hall to discuss the contested will of Geneva Miller. It was a thinly veiled attempt by the Millers to publicly cement their narrative, to paint Evelyn as a manipulative usurper and to sway community opinion so firmly against her that the circuit judge, upon his arrival, would have little choice but to rule in their favor. It was meant to be her final, formal humiliation. For Cole, it was a call to battle. The church hall was packed that evening, the air thick with the smell of kerosene, damp wool, and self-righteousness. Evelyn sat in the front pew, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Cole sat beside her, a solid, unmovable presence. He had insisted on coming, had insisted they face this together. To see them sitting there, side by side, was a scandal in itself, and the whispers and hostile stares that followed them to their seats were like a physical force. Sheriff Miller stood at the pulpit, his presence filling the small hall. He spoke in a solemn, paternalistic tone about his duty to the community, about protecting the legacy of a dear, departed woman who, in her final days, had sadly become confused. He spoke of opportunists who prey on the weak, and of the need for the good people of Briar Ridge to stand together to see that justice was done. He never said Evelyn's name, but every word was a stone cast directly at her. When he finished, to a chorus of murmuring agreement, he asked if anyone had anything to add before they took a formal vote to petition the court. A silence fell over the room. Then, Cole Whitaker stood up. A collective gasp went through the crowd. He was an outsider, a hired hand. He had no standing here, but he stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the sea of hostile faces. And there was a quiet authority in his bearing that commanded their attention. "I have something to say," he said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "My name is Cole Whitaker. I have only been here a short while, so I do not know the long histories that you all share. But I know what I have seen with my own 2 eyes. He turned his gaze to Sheriff Miller, who was watching him with a look of pure venom. "I have seen a woman work harder than any 2 men, a woman who cared for a dying friend with a tenderness and loyalty that was a thing to behold. I have seen a woman whose garden is a testament to her hope and her spirit, a woman who can gentle a frightened horse and stand fast in a storm." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You all speak of her past. I have seen her present, and I have seen the way she is treated. I have seen her threatened, and I have seen her shunned. You call her an opportunist. I call her a survivor. You whisper about her character. I have witnessed her integrity. Whatever happened in this town 10 years ago, I do not believe for 1 second that the woman sitting beside me is a liar. I believe she is innocent. I believe she is strong. And I believe she is worthy of the same respect and decency you would ask for yourselves." He looked directly at Evelyn, his eyes full of a fierce, unwavering belief that was more intimate than any touch. "And I want it known, by everyone here, that I stand with her. Any threat against her is a threat against me. Her fight is my fight." He sat down. The silence in the room was absolute. A ringing, shocked void. He had not just defended her. He had held up a mirror to the town, and they did not like the reflection. He had challenged their comfortable lies, their decade of complicity. Before anyone could react, he took Evelyn's hand, stood, and led her out of the church hall, leaving the town to reckon with his words and their own conscience. The reckoning came that very night. Maddox Miller, publicly shamed and stripped of his power by Cole's simple, honest words, was not a man for reckoning. He was a man for retaliation, and his rage, like his cruelty, knew no bounds. Evelyn was woken from a restless sleep by a strange, flickering orange light dancing on her bedroom walls. A smell, acrid and sharp, filled the air. Smoke. She threw off her blankets and ran to the window. Her heart stopped. The new cedar fence Cole had built for her was ablaze, and the fire was spreading with terrifying speed to her garden, the place where she had poured all her hope for a future. A guttural cry of denial tore from her throat. Without thinking of her own safety, she ran from the house, grabbing a heavy horse blanket from the porch. The heat was a living thing, a searing beast that drove her back, but she pushed forward. This was hers. She had nurtured every single plant from a tiny seed. It was the one part of her life she had managed to make grow. She would not let him take it from her. She began beating at the edges of the fire with the blanket, the thick smoke clawing at her lungs, her eyes streaming with tears. Embers landed on her dress and she frantically slapped them out. She plunged her hands into the dirt, trying to create a firebreak, not feeling the intense heat searing the tender skin of her palms. She was a whirlwind of desperate energy, a woman fighting for the last small piece of her life that felt whole and good. Cole saw the glow from his bunkhouse window and was on his horse in seconds, galloping across the field with a terror in his heart he had not felt since the night he had lost his wife. He saw Evelyn, a small, frantic figure silhouetted against a wall of flame, and his blood ran cold. He leaped from his horse and ran into the maelstrom, shouting her name. He grabbed her, pulling her back from the inferno. She fought against him, her voice a raw, broken scream. "No, my garden! He can't have it!" "Evelyn, it is too late. You have to get out," he yelled, his words barely audible over the roar of the fire. He swept her up into his arms. She was shockingly light. She finally went limp against his chest, her body racked with shuddering sobs. He carried her through the thick, choking smoke, his own lungs burning, his only thought to get her to safety. As he reached the clear air near the cabin, she clung to him, her face buried in his neck. "Do not let the night take me again," she whispered, her voice a raw, terrified plea. He understood then that this was not just about a fire. This was about the same darkness, the same violent hand that had reached for her all those years ago. This was Maddox, trying to finish what he had started. Cole held her tighter, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. "Never again," he vowed, his voice thick with smoke and emotion. "I will never let the night take you again." Inside the cabin, the air was safe, but the horror of the fire still raged outside the window. He gently set her down and lit a lamp. In its soft glow, he saw her hands. Her palms were red and blistered. Dirt and soot ground into the raw skin. A fresh wave of fury washed over him, so intense it made him dizzy. He took a deep breath, pushing it down. She needed him calm. She needed him gentle. He fetched the basin and filled it with cool water from the pump. He knelt before her and carefully, tenderly, began to clean her wounds. He worked in silence, his touch infinitely careful on her burned skin. She watched him, her eyes wide and dark in her soot-streaked face, the last of her defenses, the final, brittle wall around her heart, dissolved in the face of his quiet, reverent care. When he was done, he looked up at her, his gray eyes full of a pain that mirrored her own. The space between them was charged with all the words they had not said, all the longing they had held in check. He reached up and gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek with his thumb. Her skin was soft beneath his calloused touch. She did not flinch. She leaned into his hand. A silent surrender. That was all the invitation he needed. He rose and drew her to her feet, pulling her into an embrace that was both desperate and tender. He kissed her, and this kiss was not like the others. It was a kiss of shared trauma, of fierce devotion, of a love that had been tested by fire and had not burned away. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bedroom. There, in the flickering light from the dying fire outside, they came together. It was slow and aching and beautiful in its sorrow. It was a communion of two broken souls finding wholeness in each other. For Cole, it was an act of worship, a tender and desperate attempt to heal her wounds with his love. For Evelyn, it was a reclamation. In his arms, she was not a victim. She was not broken. She was a woman, wanted and cherished, who was finally safe. Every touch was a question, and her response a quiet, trusting answer. She was taking back the night, and filling it not with fear and violation, but with love and a profound, healing peace. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together under the thin quilt, the smell of smoke still clinging to their skin. A single, silent tear slid down Evelyn's cheek. Then another. Cole held her closer, his heart clenching with fear that he had hurt her. "Evelyn," he whispered, "I have never felt wanted and safe before." She whispered back, her voice thick with an emotion so deep it was almost painful. "Not like this. Not ever." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his own eyes burning. "I am not going anywhere," he promised, his voice rough. "I am staying. With you." And in that moment, he knew it was the truest vow he had ever made. He was no longer a drifter. He had found his home, right here, in her arms. The fire and Cole's public declaration split Briar Ridge down the middle. In the days that followed, the town was a place of uneasy alliances and open hostility. Some, horrified by the cowardly act of arson, came to Evelyn's door. The blacksmith's wife brought a pot of stew and a jar of burn salve, her eyes downcast with shame. "We should have listened to your father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Others offered a quiet nod of support when she passed them in the street. But others doubled down in their loyalty to the Millers, spitting her name like poison. They said she had probably set the fire herself, for sympathy. They saw Cole's devotion as proof of her witchcraft. The town was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Cole knew he could not fight this with his fists. He had to use the one weapon the Millers feared, a higher law. He wrote a long, detailed letter to the circuit judge in the territorial capital. He laid out everything: the history of the original accusation against Maddox, the suspicious death of Judge Carr, the ongoing campaign of threats and intimidation, the town's complicity, and the final, violent act of arson. He formally requested an immediate judicial inquiry. He sent the letter with a trusted driver on the next stagecoach heading east. 2 weeks later, Judge Elias Thorne arrived in Briar Ridge. He was a thin, severe-looking man with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through a man's defenses. He did not convene a public trial. Instead, he held a small, private hearing in the back room of the hotel. He summoned Evelyn, Cole, Sheriff Miller, Maddox, and a handful of others, including Silas Henderson. Evelyn walked into that room with her head held high. Her hands were bandaged, but her spirit was not. Cole was at her side. his hand resting on the small of her back. When it was her turn to speak, she looked directly at Judge Thorne and told her story. Her voice did not tremble. She told the truth, just as she had 10 years before. But this time was different. This time, she was not an isolated, terrified girl. She was a woman supported by a man who believed in her without question, and that belief was her shield and her sword. When she finished, the judge turned his piercing gaze on Maddox, who squirmed in his chair, his arrogant smirk finally gone. Then he looked at the sheriff, whose face had become a pale, sweaty mask. The judge had seen this story before, in a dozen other dusty towns where power and corruption had been allowed to fester. He knew the truth when he heard it. The verdict was swift and decisive. There would be no public disgrace, no messy trial in Briar Ridge. That, the judge decided, would only tear the community apart further. Instead, he delivered justice with surgical precision. He spoke quietly with Sheriff Miller for 10 minutes. When they emerged, Miller walked to the center of the room, unpinned the silver star from his chest, and laid it on the table. He would be resigning, effective immediately, for health reasons. Then, 2 federal marshals the judge had brought with him stepped forward and put Maddox Miller in handcuffs. He was under arrest for arson, intimidation of a witness, and on suspicion of involvement in the death of Judge Isaac Carr. He would be taken to the prison in the capital to await trial in a different county, far from his father's influence. Maddox's face was a picture of disbelief, his arrogance crumbling into raw, pathetic fear. As they led him away, a deep, uneasy silence fell over the town of Briar Ridge. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a long and terrible fever that had finally broken. The lies that had held the town together for a decade had been burned away, and in the ashes, no one was quite sure what would grow. The departure of the Millers left a vacuum in Briar Ridge, a hollow space where fear and power had once resided. The town fell into an uneasy silence, the quiet of a patient recovering from a long and terrible fever. People looked at each other differently, their gazes now holding a measure of shame, of questions they had failed to ask for a decade. The lie they had all lived with had been exposed, and its absence was as jarring as a constant noise suddenly gone quiet. For Evelyn and Cole, the silence was a space to begin building. Their world was the ranch, a place scarred but not broken. The fire had consumed half of the garden and blackened a section of the barn, leaving behind the skeletal remains of the new cedar fence. The property, long neglected under Miss Geneva's illness and Evelyn's siege, felt tired and worn down to the bone. It was a reflection of Evelyn herself, and just as she was beginning to heal, so too would the land. They started the next morning. As the sun crested the horizon and painted the plains in hues of soft gold and rose, they worked not with frantic energy, but with the slow, deliberate rhythm of creation. Together, they cleared the scorched earth of the garden, turning the blackened soil to let it breathe again. They tore down the burned sections of the barn and, using salvaged timber, began to rebuild. The steady, percussive sound of Cole's hammer became the new heartbeat of the ranch, a sound of construction, not decay. They worked side by side, a partnership of few words but profound understanding. He would anticipate her need for a tool. She would have a dipper of cool water ready when he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. They were mending more than just the ranch. They were mending the world, creating a small, safe corner of it that was entirely their own. One week, they gave the porch a fresh coat of white paint, covering the old, peeling gray like a clean bandage over a wound. Sitting there in the evenings, watching the sunset, felt like an act of quiet triumph. As they rebuilt the physical space, Evelyn began to rebuild her space within the community, but on her own terms. She had spent a decade hiding from the town. Now, she decided to invite it in. She put a small, handwritten sign in the window of the general store. Sewing and mending lessons for girls, inquire at the old Miller place. The first Saturday, only 3 girls showed up. They were shy, nervous, the daughters of homesteaders who lived on the fringes of the town society. They huddled together on Evelyn's newly painted porch, clutching scraps of fabric. Evelyn greeted them not as the town pariah, but as a teacher, her voice gentle, her smile warm and genuine. She led them into her cabin, which was no longer a dark place of hiding, but a room filled with light and the scent of brewing tea. She taught them the simple, essential magic of the needle and thread, how to piece together a quilt block, how to turn a torn dress into a sturdy apron, how to embroider a simple flower onto a collar. As their fingers worked, their tongues loosened. The cabin filled with the quiet chatter and occasional laughter of young girls, a sound Evelyn had not heard in her home since she was a girl herself. It was a sound of life, of innocence, of community. Word spread. The next week, 5 girls came. The week after, 7, including the blacksmith's daughter, whose mother had brought the burn salve. Over time, the whispers that had followed Evelyn for a decade began to lessen, replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. She was no longer just the disgraced judge's daughter. She was Miss Carr, the woman who could fix any tear and whose cabin was a place of warmth and welcome. She was slowly, stitch by stitch, mending her relationship with the town she had once sworn to hate. One afternoon, as the girls were packing up their sewing baskets, the youngest of them, a frank and curious child of 8 named Sarah, looked up at Evelyn with wide, serious eyes. "Miss Carr," she asked, her voice clear in the quiet room, "is it true you are a witch?" The other girls froze, their mothers, who had come to collect them, stiffening with horror at the child's bluntness. A tense silence fell over the room. Evelyn looked down at the little girl, and a soft, sad smile touched her lips. She knelt so that she was at eye level with the child and gently brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice full of a quiet, weary strength. "I am not a witch. I am just someone who survived." The simple, profound honesty of her answer settled over the room. The mothers looked at her with a new understanding, a deep and sudden empathy for the unimaginable weight this woman had carried for so long. In that moment, she was not a scandal or a mystery. She was a survivor, and that was a thing to be honored, not feared. As Evelyn healed her connection to the world, Cole focused on healing the deepest of her hidden wounds. He noticed the bed she slept on was the same narrow, iron-framed bed that had been in her room for years, the bed that had held her through a decade of nightmares. He said nothing, but one evening, he began to work in the barn, and the sound of a saw cutting through fresh pine filled the air. For a week, he spent his evenings there. Evelyn would bring him his supper, and they would eat together in the lamplight, the scent of fresh-cut wood all around them. He was building her a new bed frame. It was made of solid, golden pine, the headboard carved with a simple, elegant pattern of a climbing rose. It was a thing of beauty, but it was also a fortress, strong, sturdy, and built by his own loving hands. The night he brought it into the house and assembled it in her room, Evelyn was overcome with emotion. He was not just giving her a piece of furniture. He was giving her a new place to rest, a sanctuary free from the ghosts of the past. That night, as they lay in the new bed, the clean scent of pine surrounding them, she slept without a single nightmare for the first time she could remember. They did not speak much on those nights. They simply held each other, their bodies fitting together in the quiet dark. They were healing each other, his steadfast love smoothing over the scars the world had carved into her, her gentle trust filling the empty spaces in his own lonely heart. They had built a life from the ashes, a fragile but beautiful piece. Evelyn had found her place, a quiet purpose that gave her a sense of belonging she had never thought she would feel again. Which was why, when Cole spoke of leaving, a sliver of the old fear returned. They were on the porch, watching the stars prick the vast, velvety blackness of the night sky. The air was cool and clean. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her, "about the future, our future." He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I was a drifter for a long time. Evelyn, I never thought I would put down roots again. But you are my roots." He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious in the starlight. "Before all this happened, back when I first got here, I used some of the money I had saved to put a claim on a piece of land up in the northern hills. There is a creek that runs year-round, and good pasture. It is a place to build something that will last." He took a deep breath. "I want you to come with me. I want us to build it together. A new place, a new start, with no ghosts." Her heart leaped with a mixture of joy and terror. To leave? To leave this place that held so much pain, but was also the only home she knew. To leave the small, careful life she had just begun to build. The fear of the unknown was a powerful, paralyzing force. She looked around at the ranch, at the white porch, the dark shape of the rebuilt barn, the sleeping garden. She had fought so hard for this. He saw the hesitation in her eyes. "We do not have to," he said softly. "We can stay here. I will stay wherever you are. This is your home." She looked back at him, at his dear, honest face, and saw the truth. Her home was not this land. It was not this house. Her home was him. He was her sanctuary. With him, she could be home anywhere. A slow smile spread across her face. "When do we leave?" she asked. The news of their departure rippled through the town. A week before they were set to leave, they received a formal invitation delivered by the blacksmith's daughter. The townspeople wanted to hold a farewell gathering for them. Evelyn's first instinct was to refuse, but Cole convinced her it was the right thing to do. A final, necessary act of closure. The gathering was held in the church hall, the very room that had once been the site of her public condemnation, and later, his defiant defense of her. The atmosphere was awkward, charged with unspoken apologies and years of regret, but it was also sincere. Silas Henderson shook Cole's hand and clapped him on the back, telling him he was a fool for leaving the best hand he had ever had, but that he understood. Several of the women, the same ones who had once whispered about her, approached Evelyn, the blacksmith's wife, her eyes full of genuine remorse, pressed a beautifully stitched quilt into her hands. "For your new home," she said. "We were wrong. Evelyn, we were scared, and we were cruel. I hope one day you can forgive this town." Some people stayed silent, offering only a shy smile or a nod. But their presence was an apology in itself. They brought gifts, sacks of flour, jars of preserves, a new cast-iron skillet. It was a humble, heartfelt offering of peace. As Evelyn looked around at the faces of the people who had once been her tormentors, she felt no anger, no bitterness. All she felt was a quiet, sad peace. They had all been living in a prison of lies, and now they were all, in their own way, finally free. They rode out at dawn 2 days later, a single wagon loaded with their few precious belongings: the new quilt, the skillet, Cole's tools, and Evelyn's sewing basket. The air was crisp and cool, the sky a vast, promising canvas of pale blue. As they reached the top of the ridge overlooking the valley, Evelyn pulled back on the reins and turned for one last look at Briar Ridge. She saw the steeple of the church, the smoke curling from the chimneys, and the small, scarred ranch that had been both her prison and her salvation. She took a deep breath, and then turned her face forward, toward the northern hills, and did not look back again. Cole reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder as the wagon rolled on, the wild, open country stretching out before them. The land was vast and untamed, the same land that had once seemed so full of hardship and loneliness. But now, with Cole beside her, it looked different. It looked like hope. She turned to him, her heart so full of love it felt as if it might burst. The words that had once been a confession of brokenness and fear were now a declaration of strength and certainty. "I can't stop wanting you," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable joy. "And I never will." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles as the cool morning wind brushed their faces. He smiled, his gray eyes full of their shared future, and together they rode on. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with each other. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.